So usually when you see a video titled like this, you might be half expecting me to be talking about some complete and utter nonsense, like using the power of wanting things hard enough as a means of manifesting a new car or something else you definitely don't actually need. Or maybe I'm going to twist my words around, and halfway through the video you will realize I'm actually just talking about something completely mundane like electricity or whatever. This video is not going to be like that, for you see, unlike so many other quacky new age charlatans on YouTube, I am an actual crazy person, and in this video, I am going to actually try to convince you that actual magic is actually a real thing. Before we get started, however, I would like to briefly and shamelessly plug our brand spanking new channel membership offer. You can join for just $1.99 USD per month, and if you do, you get some cool emojis you can use in the comments. Your comments get prioritized, you get a neat little badge icon for your profile, and you get a special role on our Discord server which tells me that I'm not allowed to yell at you in all caps when you disagree with me about something. I set these memberships at the lowest price point option because I care much more about using this as a way to drive engagement and help the channel grow than I do about making money from this. So if you like what I do here, then joining our membership is a great way to help out. In addition to that, starting next month, I'm going to be uploading at least one members only video every month in which I'm going to address questions or objections which have been brought up in the comments and also talk about a lot of other things that I haven't been able to talk about in my regular video releases yet. Thank you so much, of course, to those who have already joined. Happy Halloween, and now, without any further ado, let's get into the topic of today's video. I want us to start with a figure who will probably be familiar at this point to those who are familiar with my work here. The British mathematician and metaphysician Alfred North Whitehead. Now, I will go ahead and give a disclaimer that I'm going to be starting this off with some rather technical considerations, so if you are new here, just bear with me. I promise these ideas really aren't as daunting as they might first appear to be, and if this seems a bit out there, then I must assure you that understanding what I am about to talk about is absolutely worth the effort, as the implications are, as we will see, profound beyond any possibility of overstatement. As we have discussed previously in his metaphysical works, Whitehead came to reject the mechanistic understanding of nature, which Western science and philosophy had inherited from the Cartesian and Newtonian revolutions of previous centuries. Rather than seeing nature as a vast clockwork machine, Whitehead came to see nature as fundamentally alive. Prompted by the revolutions within science which had come to unfold over the previous decades, Whitehead came to see that our basic assumptions about the nature of reality itself were simply no longer adequate in making sense of the world which our scientific endeavors had unveiled. Whitehead thus came to develop within his 1929 Process and Reality, a framework for understanding the world in which nature is seen to be comprised of what he called droplets of awareness, or electromagnetic occasions of experience. Whitehead's aim was almost unimaginably ambitious. He sought to create not simply a new kind of theory, but an entirely new framework for understanding nature itself, including consciousness, animacy, space, and time. For Whitehead, atoms were not merely microscopic billiard balls bouncing around and sticking to one another in accordance with invariant laws. Rather, Whitehead saw atoms as the most basic organisms, as tiny, self-referential knots of electromagnetic consciousness, which are driven towards both self-perpetuation and symbiosis by an inner drive towards creative realization which animates the cosmos as a whole. Whitehead saw the fundamental constituents of the world as self-organizing, experiential processes. This is something which we have discussed more thoroughly in other videos, so for now I'm not going to break down the anatomy of these droplets of experience in detail. Instead, I want to focus upon something which Whitehead seems to have discovered over the course of actually writing Process and Reality, namely the phenomenon which he referred to as hybrid prehension. Prehension was a term which Whitehead used to refer to the general form of interaction by which these self-organizing droplets of actuality came to contribute themselves to each other's formative processes, or by which forms of potentiality came to give shape to such organic events. A prehension is, in essence, a feeling within which forms of actuality and potentiality come to contribute themselves to the achievement of determinacy by moments of creative awareness. Whitehead details 3 distinct modes of prehension within Process and Reality. The first is physical prehension, what we might otherwise simply refer to as physical causation, within which past events come to contribute themselves to subsequent events. Physical prehension essentially serves as a sort of ontological inertia by which the physical determinations of previous events come to contribute their discrete definition unto events which are subsequently unfolding. When 2 complex systems of such events, such as 2 atoms, come into physical contact with one another, they might repel one another, or they might come to form a chemical bond. In either case, the ontological inertia of these 2 systems are attempting to maintain themselves, and the deflection or chemical bond which results can thus be understood as a manner by which the conflicting inertial drives of those systems can come to compromise with one another. We see this principle of ontological inertia in essentially all of the principles of physics. The conservation of mass, energy, and momentum can all be seen as expressions of this underlying tendency of ontological inertia within nature. Things want to maintain whatever kind of order they have come to achieve. The topographical matrix which comes to emerge from such physical relationships is what we refer to as space, or what Whitehead would call the extensive continuum. But just as things strive to maintain their order, things similarly strive to resolve their unrest, tension, incoherence, or chaos. No system is ever completely harmonious. There is always some form of tension or incompleteness, which the system then strives to resolve by processes such as fission or symbiosis, expansion or contraction, consumption or expulsion. Through such striving, the organic processes which constitute reality come to engage in what Whitehead refers to as conceptual prehension, in which processes come to feel their way forward through a possibility space comprised of possible complex forms, complex structures of possibility, which Whitehead refers to as eternal objects. All organic processes are dipolar, comprised of a physical pole which consists of physical prehensions, as well as a mental pole which is comprised of conceptual prehensions. The former consists in the inheritance of the past, whereas the latter consists in the ingression of possible futures. These 2 modes thus constitute the basic units of consciousness, which give shape to reality itself. Yet, as Whitehead came to elaborate his ideas further into a reconceptualization of space and the notion of extension, he came to realize that a 3rd mode of prehension must be at play, what he dubbed hybrid prehension. In physical prehension, an occasion of experience comes to inherit the past physical qualities of previous events. Within hybrid prehension, an occasion of experience would come to inherit the past mental structures of previous events. Organic processes are constantly navigating a kind of morphological space, and the shape of such a phase space is what Whitehead would call the mental pole of such an organic system. Hybrid prehension, therefore, would be the means by which the structure of such a mental space comes to contribute itself to the mental structure of subsequent processes. To put this in much more blunt and less technical terms, this essentially amounts to a kind of telepathy. More specifically, it is a means by which the morphogenetic poles of organic systems come to give shape to similar morphogenetic poles of other systems. This idea is, I believe, the exact same concept as that of morphic resonance, which has been developed by the British biologist Rupert Sheldrake, though Whitehead's formulation of this idea is much more generalizable and much more technical. If you want to learn more about Sheldrake's ideas and how they pertain to more recent research by developmental biologists, then you should check out my playlist on the topic via the link above. For now, I want us to focus on one important insight: that such relationships of mental or formative causation need not be mediated by space and time in the same manner as physical or efficient causation. As Whitehead states on the matter, quote, "A pure physical prehension is the transmission of physical feelings, while hybrid prehension is the transmission of mental feelings. There is no reason to assimilate the conditions for hybrid prehensions to those for pure physical prehensions. Indeed, the contrary hypothesis is the more natural. For the conceptual pole does not share in the coordinate divisibility of the physical pole. Thus, the doctrine of immediate objectification for the mental poles and of mediate objectification for the physical poles seems most consonant with the philosophy of organism." This conclusion has some empirical support, both from the evidence for peculiar instances of telepathy and from the instinctive apprehension of a tone of feeling in ordinary social intercourse. End quote. So, we expect physical interactions to operate in accordance with proximity. Things interact when they are able to touch one another within physical space. We feel that there should not be any spooky action at a distance, yet Whitehead illustrates how the very reality of space itself only comes to emerge through the manner by which physical prehensions structure their relationships. Since hybrid prehension is not thought to operate in this manner, then spooky action at a distance may very well be the norm rather than the exception. The physical structure of a process, such as that of an atom, only needs to compromise its ontological inertia with that of another atom if they come into physical contact. When this compromise occurs, one atom might bounce off of the other, exchanging some of its physical momentum for a change in direction and causing the other atom to move as well. Both atoms are resisting change in their physical structure, including such properties as their velocity, and thus come to a kind of compromise that we see expressed in such principles as the Newtonian axiom that every action is to be met with an equal but opposite reaction. Without physical proximity, there is no need for such compromise, and thus there should be no spooky physical action at a distance. Yet, within Whitehead's metaphysical scheme, physicality is only half of the picture. There is also the mental pole of actual entities. If an entity is inheriting the formative or morphogenetic properties of another entity, then this influence needn't be directly related to spatial or temporal proximity. Within a mechanistic understanding of nature, we tend to assume that events are fully determined by immediately prior events, like a chain of dominoes knocking each other over. But with something like hybrid prehension or morphic resonance, we see that there can in fact be influences of formative causation, which occur independently of physical proximity, and moreover which can allow for events within the distant past to contribute themselves directly to the present without physical mediation. This insight thus implicates what Rupert Sheldrake refers to as the presence of the past, and what the philosopher Henri Bergson saw as the memory which is fundamental to nature itself. Bergson distinguished between two forms of memory in nature. The first is habit, by which the past comes to presence itself through passively shaping the processes which unfold within the present. The second is recollection, by which consciousness comes to bring the past into relation with the present through conscious agency. For Bergson, such memory is fundamental to the distinction between the worlds of the mechanistic and the animate. Mechanistic processes operate on the basis of inertia and thus direct successions of physical interaction, while living processes actively bring the past into relation with the present. When we act immediately without thinking, we are behaving in a more mechanistic way. Conversely, when we pause to deliberate, we are bringing the past, such as things we have learned or experienced in the past, into the unfolding of the present moment, such that those past events can inform the manner by which the present moment comes to concretize. Within the mechanistic understanding of nature, we tend to imagine that time and causation look something like this. Every row is a single slice of time, with each node or event determined entirely by other events which are physically proximate to it, and only able to contribute determinative influence to events which are immediately subsequent. Looking at nature through the morphogenetic understanding developed by figures such as Whitehead, Bergson, Sheldrake, and others, however, we can see that nature, time, and causation are in fact much more complex. Events are in fact able to reach out and touch one another, as it were, across both physical space and temporal sequence. Physical space and temporal sequencing constitute only one kind of relational topography, specifically one in which inertia of physical structure is the dominant mode of relationality. If we presume that this physical topography is exhaustive of reality, we blind ourselves to the more subtle topographies of relationality, which are in fact more fundamental to nature than the physical. Physical space presupposes morphological space, but not vice versa. In a universe which consisted entirely of light, for example, there would be no physical space to speak of. Within dynamic systems theory and developmental biology, this concept of morphological space, or phase space, has proven to be crucial in understanding the behavior of complex and organic systems. The argument which we are making here is that proximity within such morphological spaces can facilitate formative causal relationships which transcend those of physicality and spatial proximity. We can understand this as a kind of fabric through which all self-organizing processes are interwoven with one another on the basis of their proximity within morphological spaces. The minds of a parent and a child, for example, should share a great deal of overlap within such morphological space. They are extremely similar in terms of the morphology of the processes which constitute them. As such, we would expect the mental processes of a parent to have a great deal of influence in conditioning the development of the child's mental processes, even independently of physical interaction between them. Some would probably want to protest here by saying that we can explain such influence simply by reference to genes, but if we look to the actual sciences of genetics and developmental biology, we find that this is in fact not the case at all. What we do find is that the relationships between genes and phenotypic traits are extremely messy, and moreover, recent findings, particularly through research conducted by Tufts University biologist Michael Levin, suggest that the general morphological traits of organisms are not controlled by gene sequences at all, but rather by bioelectric fields. Genes, according to Dr. Levin, do not create higher-order morphological characteristics such as eyes, brains, and other such organs. Rather, the role of genes is in determining the protein toolkits, which are available to the individual cells which make up living bodies. As Levin puts it, genes code for the hardware of the organism, but not the software. The morphological software is, at the very least, distributed throughout the organism's entire body, and I am arguing, throughout the bodies of innumerable other organisms as well. Again, this is a topic which we have covered in significantly more detail in our dedicated series on morphic resonance, so I'm not going to go over each and every possible line of evidence in this video. Instead, here I want to focus on what some of the broader and spookier implications of this theoretical framework might be. As we have already seen, Whitehead was very content to conclude that telepathic influences between human minds could be a result of such phenomena. And in one of our previous videos, we looked at the empirical and experimental evidence which suggests that this is in fact the case. But the implications of such phenomena could be much more drastic than subtle telepathic influences between human minds. The big picture here is ultimately that our entire framework of understanding nature, which has been presumed by science since the days of Galileo, must be called into question. The scientific understanding of the world has always presumed that nature operates on the basis of physical laws, which determine the way that the physical properties of entities in the world come to interact with one another. If this morphogenetic understanding of nature is to be taken seriously, then we must also take seriously the implication that there really are no laws of nature at all, but rather semi-constants which come to form in the same manner as behavioral habits. The organisms which make up the world operate by navigating morphological spaces, and these morphological spaces come to be sculpted over time by the continual life activities of such organisms. Patterns come to develop, and through this process, broad distributions of possibility come to concretize into more narrow, deterministic developmental pathways in which there is much less morphological freedom. This analysis can apply just as much to the physiological development of simple living cells, just as much as it can apply to the behavior and even thought patterns of more complex organisms. But if we use the term organism in the more general sense, which Whitehead and Sheldrake indicate, then this reasoning also applies just as much to the structures of chemical compounds such as proteins, and to the astrophysical morphologies of stars, solar systems, and galaxies. Our understanding of the history of our world has been conditioned for the past several centuries by the presumption that the basic constants of nature have not changed. This presumption allows scientists to look at the constants which seem to be operative today and then rewind our models of the universe so as to give us an idea of how our cosmos has evolved over the course of millions or billions of years. If we are calling this presumption into question, then we are indeed calling into question virtually everything that we think we know about the evolution of our cosmos, and maybe even the more recent history of our planet and our species. So before we dive into some of the more radical implications which might unfold from such a reconceptualization, I want to give a bit of a disclaimer, especially for those who might be new to this channel. I am a philosopher, not a conspiracy theorist. The term conspiracy theory itself is a kind of linguistic trick used to disparage and discredit ideas by the effortless stamping of a label. Many conspiracies are actually real, and if that's news to you, then you might have found yourself in the wrong corner of YouTube. The reality is that we are in fact lied to about a great many things on a regular basis, and even when such lies are not part of a coordinated and nefarious effort, falsehoods are often able to simply perpetuate themselves, especially when a falsehood becomes enmeshed within the power structures of massive, affluent institutions such as academia, mainstream journalism, governments, or international organizations. We have, I believe, abundant reason to believe that the commonly accepted and perpetuated narratives about our world and our past are in many ways highly misleading and in many cases demonstrably false. Even when falsehoods are obvious or when certainty is far from clear, overconfidence in accepted theories can very easily come to take on a life of its own as careers, publications, institutions, and hierarchies of expertise and authority come to be built upon such theories. We can always defer to the so-called experts as a way to compensate for our own uncertainty, or we can recognize that we may have gotten things wrong and take action by looking towards new possibilities. In what follows, I want us to look at what some of those possibilities might look like. Rupert Sheldrake has suggested that this phenomenon, which he terms morphic resonance, could allow us to actually understand how memory operates in everyday life. Again, this is a topic which we explore in more detail in my series about morphic resonance, but for now I just want to present the basic conceptual framework. Memories are not stored in the brain in the same way that computer memories are stored in a hard disk or flash drive. Rather, memories are essentially stored in the past itself. In our process of recollection, we do not look for a particular file which is imprinted within the structure of a specific part of the brain. Instead, our brains act as something more akin to a radio receiver, tuning into the events which occurred in the past such that our minds are then able to recreate the experiences which exist within the past. The memory essentially grows from a kind of morphological seed or germ within the processes of the human mind. Think about what the process of recollection is actually like empirically. Let's say that you drive to work every day, and on most days, you stop at one of a number of different coffee shops or gas stations to get food, coffee, or fuel. Someone then asks you to remember exactly where you stopped and what you bought on the way to work on the Monday of 3 weeks prior. If your memory is anything like mine, then this might prove to be a very difficult task. But if you do manage to remember those events, it will probably be because you managed to think of something unique which happened that day, which you were then able to link up with your stop on the drive to work. Maybe someone called you that morning who you don't usually hear from, or maybe you had to stop and air up your tires and a stranger struck up a conversation with you. Now consider what is actually happening when you search your mind in this way. The memory needs to grow from a particular starting point. Since you have very similar experiences almost every day, it's very difficult to determine which starting point is actually correct. Is your mind recreating the experience from the Monday in question, or is it recreating Tuesday or Wednesday by mistake? You need a way to make sure that the memory being recreated is the correct one, and thus you need something specific to latch onto in order to properly distinguish between experiences which are extremely close together within the morphological space which is actually available to your imagination. We might lose our capacity to access certain memories because we lose track of those anchors which we might use to recall them, but there is nevertheless no evidence that there is an upper limit on how many memories a human mind can have access to. Nor does empirical evidence indicate that there are any specific places in the brain where memories are stored. Looking at this through the lens of the mechanistic worldview, it would appear that the brain is some kind of ultimate supercomputer, which somehow has virtually unlimited storage capacity. From the perspective of a morphogenetic science, however, this all seems quite natural. The brain doesn't store memories at all. The contents of your mind exist just as much within the past as they do within the present. If we regard physical, efficient causation as the only factor at play within the processes of nature, then the past seems to be simply gone, inert, and ineffectual, except insofar as the past might reverberate through the physical sequence of causation. As Bertrand Russell once put it, it may very well be the case that our entire world was created last Thursday. We simply blinked into existence with memories and holes in our socks from the get-go. The past, in other words, seems to be almost a kind of illusion, something that presumably was real at one point, but which seems now to have been annihilated by the ruthless onslaught of time. But through the perspective I am presenting here, the past is not gone. The past is very much alive in the sense that even events which occurred many millions of years ago are capable of shaping the endless unfolding of our lives and the world around us. The past is not dead, but rather immortalized, now serving as a kind of foundation which actively participates in the creation of the architecture which we are building upon it. So now let us finally turn to what some of the spookier implications might be here. If we recollect past events by tuning into them, does this mean that it might be possible for us to tune into and thus relive experiences which happen to other people? It is now a rather well-documented phenomenon that memories and even personality traits seem to be able to migrate from person to person through organ transplants, most notably in heart transplants. Although there have been a few more mundane explanations of this phenomenon which have been suggested, none of these seem remotely adequate to actually explaining the facts at hand. Some have suggested that because the heart contains neurons, then perhaps those neurons can store memories in a manner analogous to the computer memory which is presumed to store memories in the brain. But even though the heart contains many neurons, the human digestive system contains even more. Moreover, the recipients of heart transplants never seem to lose memories during the procedure, meaning that if any memories were stored in their original hearts, then those memories must have been copies of memories which were also stored in the brain. What would our bodies possibly be trying to accomplish by putting extra copies of our memories inside of our hearts? Cellular memory is sometimes used as a way to hand-wave away this phenomenon. But this suggestion completely misunderstands the phenomenon of cellular memory. Cells can indeed remember things, such as the manner by which your immune system comes to remember certain kinds of viruses. But the memory of a cell is not the same as the memory of a person. The individual cells inside my brain don't remember my name. These cells don't even know who I am. Likewise, I have no way of knowing what the individual cells within my brain or heart or liver are experiencing, let alone what they might remember. Cellular memory cannot explain transplant memory migration because there is a very big difference between wholes and the parts which comprise those wholes. Yet if we look at this phenomenon through a morphogenetic understanding of memory, then we can see that the memories themselves needn't actually be stored in the heart or the brain. The memories themselves are actually within the past, and the transplanted organ only needs to be able to initiate a resonance relationship between the individual and the past events themselves. It is the seeds of the memory, not the memories themselves, which come to migrate within such organ transplants. Such memory migration might be able to occur in other ways as well. There are thousands of well-documented cases of reported reincarnation in which individuals, typically very young children, younger than the age of 6, seem to possess memories which belong to people who died prior to the individual's birth. One of the most notable collections of such case studies is to be found in the book 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation, written by the psychiatrist Ian Stevenson and published in 1966. In many of these cases, the children in question seem to possess knowledge which they would not have been able to acquire in any mundane manner, such as names, dates, and details of events which were not even known by the children's parents. Within his text, Stevenson concludes that reincarnation is in fact the best possible explanation for the phenomena which he documented, providing the following reasons. First, the large number of witnesses and the lack of apparent motivation and opportunity due to the vetting process made the hypothesis of fraud extremely unlikely. Second, the large amount of information possessed by the children was not generally consistent with the hypothesis that the children obtained that information through investigated contact between the families. And third, when there is correlation between congenital deformities or birthmarks possessed by the children and the history of the previous individual, the hypothesis of random occurrence is improbable. Stevenson and others have also noted that in almost all cases, memories of past lives tend to fade as the children grow into adolescence. Nevertheless, many quirks and distinctive personality traits which link the two individuals tend to persist even into adulthood. Whether we regard this phenomenon as being exemplary of genuine reincarnation or not depends upon certain metaphysical presuppositions. If reincarnation is the migration of an individual's soul or self, then we have to have a workable notion of what the soul or self amounts to in order to make a judgment as to whether these cases truly qualify as a continuation of the deceased person's selfhood. If memory migration were the only relevant factor, then it would seem that organ transplants are able to induce reincarnation, or at the very least, allow multiple selves to exist within the organ recipient's body. In any case, we will be leaving such considerations aside for now. What is significant here is that we seem to have detailed empirical evidence indicating that certain children are able, under certain circumstances, to tune into the lives of individuals who have lived previously, thereby reliving memories as though they were the subject's own and inheriting certain personality traits. Skeptics often try to write off such cases as simply anomalies, as isolated, inexplicable instances which cannot be easily explained, but which we cannot take as indicating a world which extends beyond the bounds of academic science. These cases, so we are told, are simply the results of a messy and complicated world in which weird things happen sometimes. But this dismissive attitude presupposes that there is no theoretical framework which these anomalous instances actually do accord with. The world is certainly capable of producing an endless array of strange events, and yet the strange events which we actually do find upon investigation all seem to point towards very specific underlying factors. If the sun randomly started blinking different colors for no apparent reason, that would certainly qualify as an anomaly. To my knowledge, there is no theoretical framework which could account for such an occurrence. If this only happened once in all of history, then that may very well be something which we simply have to write off as something which occurred for reasons which we don't yet understand, and reassure ourselves that the vast majority of things which happen in the world actually do accord with our accepted scientific understandings of nature. But the weirdness that we find in the world is not simply random strangeness. It is very specific strangeness. And if we are being honest, then the consistencies of the phenomena which cannot be explained by materialistic science should be taken as an enormous body of empirical evidence which indicates that our understanding of nature is at best incomplete. If we broaden our scope and begin looking at the many forms of strangeness which we find in our world, I think we find that this consistency becomes even more apparent. Here I want to actually tell a personal story, perhaps the one and only event in my life which I would describe as truly paranormal, or perhaps supranormal. This is an event which occurred when I was about 15 or 16 years old. At the time, I was living with my great-grandmother in an extremely isolated region of central Alabama. To describe this area as rural would be a severe understatement. The property was surrounded by an expansive forest. There were no neighbors, and the nearest store was about a 20-minute drive away. The land belonged to my family for many generations, and it was common knowledge that indigenous Alabamians had lived in the area less than a couple centuries previously. So on a random summer morning at about 7 a.m., I was outside playing basketball along the gravel road which connected the property to the nearest county road. I was completely alone and simply minding my own business. There was absolutely nothing unusual about that day. I was wide awake, it was broad daylight, I had never touched an intoxicating substance in my life up to that point, and moreover, I simply did not believe in ghosts or anything which one might describe as paranormal. At the time, I was in the prime of my new atheist phase. I was devouring books written by figures such as Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Steven Pinker, Michael Shermer, and Susan Blackmore. I was thoroughly convinced that nature was in fact fundamentally physical in essence, and that the methods of physical science could explain anything that needed to be explained. Yet on that random, ordinary Saturday morning, something happened which I simply could not explain. As I was playing basketball absent-mindedly by myself, I began to hear something coming from just beyond the tree line behind the basketball goal. To be clear, there was nothing beyond that tree line except for more trees, and those trees stretched on for many dozens of miles before the nearest road. Yet what I heard was as lucid and distinct as anything I have ever heard. I heard the sounds of what seemed to be some sort of ritualistic Amerindian powwow. There were drums and chanting and singing and stomping and essentially everything that you would associate with such an event. This was not an indistinct murmur within the sounds of wind and leaves. It was clear enough that I knew there was no way that the sound could have been produced by a recording, unless someone was hanging out in the forest in the middle of nowhere at 7 a.m. on a random Saturday and playing a recording of a powwow through the most high-fidelity speaker system I had ever heard. So I put my basketball down and sat and listened to this for at least a minute or so as my brain struggled to make some sort of sense out of what was happening. I ran through every plausible explanation and then every implausible explanation over the course of that minute before something in my mind finally clicked. Something was happening that I really just did not understand. As that realization set in, my stomach lurched in a way that I can only compare to taking a nosedive on a roller coaster. Maintaining my composure as much as possible, I finally stood up and marched back inside, Nothing else of interest happened that day, and nothing like that has ever happened to me since. Even after that experience, I still managed to cling to my materialistic presuppositions about the world for another 5 years. During that time, the memory of that experience remained in the back of my mind, quietly yet insistently suggesting that my understanding of the world was, at best, incomplete. Looking back on that experience now from a very different vantage point, the experience seems to be much more comprehensible. What I experienced was what others had experienced, perhaps many centuries previously. In that moment, for whatever reason, my mind was able to unconsciously resonate with and thereby recreate those past experiences within my own mind. That is one possibility, at least. If that were true, then that does leave one question hanging. Why did that experience feel so imminent and lucid rather than feeling like the recollection of a memory which wasn't my own? Another possibility is that the presencing of the past is something which can occur in a manner which is, at least to some extent, independent of the way that our minds come to experience such events. Most reports of apparitional phenomena seem to take this form. They seem to be within our consciousness to some degree, and yet the things which are experienced seem to have a rather concrete reality within the world. Yet another important lesson which we can derive from the works of Whitehead, Bergson, and Sheldrake is that there is no clearly defined barrier which separates our own consciousness from the world. Such a boundary is always, at most, a highly permeable membrane. Consciousness does not end where we find the division between self and world, as consciousness is something which permeates nature itself. The picture of the world which I'm here attempting to illustrate might seem very radical, especially if you feel some sense of allegiance with the officially sanctioned doctrines of academic science. But it is also worth keeping in mind that this mode of understanding is in many ways very ancient. No matter who you are or where you are from, your ancestors were, not so very long ago, people who took for granted an animistic understanding of reality. Nature was understood to consist of animacy, and that which animated the world was understood to be spirit. Individual eagles or coyotes or dragonflies were understood to be animated by the archetypal spirits of nature, which gave form and definition to all the different organisms of the world, including the natural cycles of the earth itself. If we understand such spiritual forces as the morphogenetic structures which transcend individual organisms and which constitute the domains of consciousness and potentiality within the world, then we can begin to see this understanding as much more than a mere system of metaphors. Within this shamanic mode of life, our unique power as human beings was not understood to be a matter of machine technologies, but rather our power was felt to lie in our capacity to tune into the spiritual forces which gave shape to the world. Within tribal cultures, it is often said that the shamans are capable of transforming into different animals, or communing with animal spirits as a way to facilitate medicinal practices, divination, or purification. The shaman dedicates himself or herself to achieving a kind of attunement, which can allow them to then tap into the animal powers within the natural world around us. Rupert Sheldrake has contended that forms of synchronization facilitated by morphic resonance can develop between dogs and their owners, and he has conducted multiple studies which purport to demonstrate such linkages of human and animal consciousness. As we saw with our series covering the works of Jean Gebser, The shamanic mode of life is not merely a belief system which is distinct from our own, but rather a mode of life which indicates an entire structure of human consciousness which now lies within the shadows cast by the radiance of the rational mode of consciousness. Yet for the vast majority of human history, this magical, animistic mode of attunement was the predominant structure of human awareness. If this is the case, then perhaps it is also possible that the beliefs of animistic peoples are more than mere superstition and folklore. It seems to be the case that human minds are able to tune into their own past states in everyday recollection, and it would seem that this attunement can, in more specific circumstances, extend to other human beings and even certain non-human animals. Is it possible then that a shaman might be able to enter into this web-like matrix of interwoven consciousness in such a manner that he is able to actually experience directly that which is experienced by certain animals in the world around him? Could it be that a shaman might actually be capable of literally seeing the world through the eyes of a panther, wolf, or eagle, and thereby to see the world in a manner which is normally unavailable to human awareness? Being able to enter into the consciousness of the deer within one's local biome would be very convenient if one depended on hunting such animals to survive. It's also possible that certain animals are much better attuned to patterns of temperature and precipitation than are human beings, and thus entering into such consciousness could allow a shaman to much more accurately foresee coming weather patterns, which could be very significant for a largely hunter-gatherer society. This understanding might also help to explain even more bizarre facts about the history of our species. These are the famous Nazca lines, titanic geoglyphs found upon the plains of southern Peru. These geoglyphs are very remarkable in terms of their sheer size, but also in that they could only have been seen from an aerial point of view. Why would these people put in such a monumental effort towards the creation of artworks that they would never even be able to see? Of course, this has led to an immense amount of speculation, often pertaining to ancient aircraft technologies or ancient alien visitors. I find such explanations to be extremely ignorant for a number of reasons. Those who promulgate such explanations never consider the fact that ancient peoples simply did not think in the same way that we do. It is not that ancient peoples didn't have machine technologies because they were too ignorant about how nature functions. Rather, we find no such machine technologies among ancient peoples because machine technology requires a mode of consciousness within which the human understanding of the world is experienced in a very particular manner, something which we have explored in detail in previous videos. That mode of consciousness, which Gebser refers to as rational or ego-perspectival consciousness, is less than 500 years old. Moreover, even though we find many architectural marvels which seem inexplicable, we find no alleged machine technologies at all. It is perhaps plausible that one or two civilizations might have decided to simply destroy all of their machine technologies, perhaps for some sort of religious reasons. But if we are to take this ancient machine technology narrative seriously, then we must presume that every single one of these civilizations across the globe made that exact same decision, and moreover, that they managed to do so with absolutely perfect effectiveness, without any of these civilizations leaving any records of such a decision being made. It seems to me that if we are to understand the mysteries of the past, then we must understand that human consciousness itself is something which has undergone a very drastic metamorphosis over the course of human history. The Nazca geoglyphs might be an excellent illustration of this. Could it be that these geoglyphs were created in this way because the animistic peoples of ancient Peru actually were able to see them from above? Not because they made use of some ancient alien flying machines, but because the shamans of this culture were able to actually look down upon those glyphs through synchronizing their consciousness with the consciousness of birds. Those shamans would have thus been able to see the Nazca lines as they believed the gods would have seen them, looking down from the celestial realm within which they resided. If this is the case, then the very fact that these glyphs were oriented towards a celestial realm is itself an indication that the peoples of the Nazca Desert were themselves in the midst of a metamorphosis of their own consciousness. Gebser tells us that within the animistic or magical consciousness structure, there really is no divide which separates nature from a distinct realm of gods, spirits, or forms. The magical structure is one of unity and resonance, and thus that which comes to be manifest within nature is considered to actually be spirit. The natural world is the spirit world. Yet, as the magical structure begins to transition into the mythical structure, a divide begins to open up between the heavens and the earth. The natural world of time and becoming comes to be seen as the polar complement of a transcendental realm of eternal timelessness and pure form. As such, it may be the case that we see in the Nazca lines an indication of a transition between magical and mythical consciousness, in which the vestiges of shamanic magic are seen to be interwoven with a distinctly mythical understanding of the structure of reality. It may be that those shamanic capabilities subsequently came to deteriorate in the centuries which followed the creation of the Nazca geoglyphs. The word Patagonia derives from a construction meaning giant paw or giant foot. The Patagonian plains received their name due to numerous reports by explorers that giants inhabited the region. It might seem easy enough to just write this off as hearsay or tall tales, but these reports were more than simply rumors. Letters and documents by explorers from across over 2 centuries report the existence of abnormally large humans who lived upon the Patagonian plains. In the 1520s, Ferdinand Magellan documented native tribes with individuals who were twice the height of average Europeans. Magellan and his crew allegedly captured 2 of these supposed giants with the intent of bringing them back to Spain, but they are said to have died at sea during the course of the expedition. Spanish priests who explored the area shortly thereafter likewise reported individuals who were approximately 9 feet tall, or 2.7 meters. In 1579, Sir Francis Drake also explored the land of giants and reported natives being an average 7.5 feet in height, or 2.3 meters. Later expeditions reported finding remains of deceased individuals who were up to 11 feet in height, or 3.3 meters. Similar reports were documented by Dutch explorers as well around the same time period. Even centuries later, in 1760, the British explorer John Byron reported Patagonians being up to 9 feet tall as well. Now, of course, we have to keep in mind that these reports are coming from the same people who tended to accuse basically everyone who wasn't a European of being cannibals, and we know these accusations were very rarely accurate, so it makes sense to take things with a grain of salt. Nevertheless, if these reports of unusually large people were simply exaggerations, then it is rather unusual that all of these explorers would be exaggerating about the exact same thing in essentially the exact same way. There's certainly nothing physically impossible about most of these reports. There are many outlying individuals in recent history who have been unusually tall, so we know that 9-foot-tall people are certainly possible. Yet what does seem very unusual is that these reports seem to indicate entire populations of individuals who shared this abnormal characteristic. So let's do a bit of speculation here. As we have seen in previous videos, it seems to be the case that the neo-Darwinian understanding of developmental biology is simply incorrect. Phenotypic traits are not simply a program which is encoded within an organism's DNA. Rather, the morphological structures of organisms are conditioned largely by morphogenetic fields, while genes perform the crucial yet more specific role of coding for the proteins which cells use to perform specialized functions. Your genes don't know how to make hearts or eyes or brains, as that morphological blueprint is instead distributed throughout the body, the past of the body, and other similar bodies which belong to relatives and ancestors. If we are also presuming that human consciousness was once much more capable of engaging with this realm of morphogenetic or formative causal influences, then perhaps ancient peoples were more capable of influencing the human body in the same way that they may have been more capable of influencing the human mind. Perhaps some sort of ritualistic practices and even medicinal practices might have allowed certain tribes of ancient Patagonia to actually increase their physical size, perhaps even quite drastically. Perhaps by entering into certain states of consciousness, these tribes developed a tradition which facilitated the ability of certain individuals to actively alter the morphogenetic structures which shaped their own physiology. We do know that there really is no boundary between mind and body, and we see this quite clearly in the psychosomatic medicinal practices, which unfortunately tend to be dismissed by the use of the utterly meaningless term placebo effect. If such psychosomatic phenomena can occur in an entirely unconscious manner, even in defiance of what a person actively believes will be of use, then that must bring us to ask what might be or what might have been possible if such phenomena were being consciously and deliberately acted upon over the course of numerous generations. Yet, as seems to be indicated by the Nazca lines, it seems that human consciousness within this region of South America was gradually transitioning from the magical structure to the mythical structure, and thus the capabilities which allowed for such increases in size may have been gradually deteriorating as well. Looking to reports by explorers over the course of the centuries, it seems to be that the Patagonians came to shrink over time, to the point that when explorers actually came to document precise measurements of the Patagonians in the late 18th century, the average height was reported to be between 6 to 6.5 feet, only slightly taller than what is typical throughout much of the world. So if ancient peoples may have been able to tap into the world of formative fields in such a way that they could interact with animals and perhaps their own physiology in remarkable ways, then is it possible that these capabilities may have extended to the mineral world as well? All around the world we find ancient megalithic structures, and the means by which these structures were created remains mysterious. If physical technologies were the only factor at play, then it seems almost unimaginable that these structures were created by these ancient peoples. As such, some researchers have concluded that the only possible explanation for such megaliths must be advanced machine technology. But as previously stated, I think that such an explanation simply doesn't add up. It seems to me that the more plausible explanation is one which might seem at first to be much more fantastical. that ancient peoples were capable, via some sort of practices, to manipulate the morphological constitutions of mineral substances. If such methods were in fact possible, then perhaps these ancient megalith builders were able to transmute solid stone into a semi-liquid state that would have been much easier to manipulate and work with. Something akin to the concrete substances which we utilize ubiquitously in modern architecture. These images are from a site in Cuzco, Peru, known as Sacsayhuamán, a word that I am definitely not pronouncing correctly, so deal with it. We see here that these titanic stones bulge outward, almost as though they were giant marshmallows. Carving the edges of these stones to achieve that shape by hand would have taken an enormous effort, on top of that needed to actually quarry, relocate, and set the stones to begin with. The stones also have very irregular shapes, and yet all stones fit together perfectly. If these stones were carved, then why didn't the builders just use the same shape repeatedly, such that they didn't need to carve every single stone with millimeter precision in order to fit specifically the stone it was adjacent with? Absolutely nothing here seems to add up unless we consider the possibility that these stones were poured as a semi-liquid rather than lifted as solid objects. It may also be possible that the use of morphogenetic technologies of consciousness may have allowed ancient peoples to lessen the gravitational influence of the earth which acted upon the stones, thereby making a rather easy task of endeavors which otherwise would have been simply impossible. Another interesting and extremely bizarre phenomena which we may want to consider is that of cranial deformations found in ancient skeletal remains. Elongated skulls can be found throughout virtually all parts of the world and predate all recorded human history. Examples from Australia and modern-day Iraq are believed to date back to the Proto-Neolithic period, some 10 to 12,000 years before the present, thus potentially being even older than the infamous Göbekli Tepe. So, of course, ancient aliens theorists absolutely love this phenomena, as for them, these skulls suggest some sort of extraterrestrial intervention in human history. DNA evidence, however, has yet to produce anything other than evidence that these skulls were indeed human. As with the case of seemingly inexplicable megalithic architecture, I think that a genuine explanation could be something much less science fiction, but something which nonetheless may be significantly more profound. Some of these remains clearly indicate that the skulls were deformed by intentional binding. In fact, such practices have continued throughout human history and even remain in practice in certain parts of the world to this day. If we look to the cultures that have actually practiced such artificial deformation, the reasoning is consistently indicated to be that such deformation is used as an indication of status, distinguishment, and nobility. So this would then seem to be a rather open and shut case. This is a bizarre, ritualistic practice related to dynamics of social status. There's simply no need to bring in aliens or anything else bizarre into the narrative. But this explanation, though certainly true at least in part, leaves an enormous question hanging. Why would so many different cultures from around the globe, cultures which supposedly came to develop in near complete isolation from one another, come to develop this exact same dangerous, difficult, and oddly specific practice? And why would this practice have the exact same cultural significance throughout all of these disparate cultures throughout the world and throughout history? Furthermore, some researchers who have studied such cranial deformations claim that not all examples can be explained as being a result of physical intervention. Some elongated skulls display characteristics which strongly suggest that their abnormality was a result of natural physiology rather than intentional binding or other such artificial methods of achieving such a form. It seems to me that there is something missing in the commonly accepted explanation. Thus far, we've conjectured the possibility that ancient peoples may have been able to interact with the morphogenetic strata of reality in a manner which could allow for direct interactions with the consciousness of animals, as well as direct manipulation of physical and physiological aspects of both mineral and biological entities. Looking upon the evidence presented by these cranial deformations through such a framework, we might then venture a more cohesive and adequate explanation for these anomalies. Perhaps such abnormalities were artificially created in much the same way and associated with nobility throughout such various cultures, because such an association in fact stems from a much earlier stage of humanity, in which such morphology was created by a kind of priestly nobility, a class of shaman oligarchs, as it were, who were capable of manipulating their own physiology so as to distinguish themselves from the lower castes of commoners or slaves. Perhaps it was precisely this caste of shaman oligarchs which possessed the secrets of creating the megalithic structures throughout the world which we now find to be so utterly inexplicable. Perhaps it was these shamanic rulers or their descendants who were capable of looking down through the eyes of eagles upon the great geoglyphs of the Nazca Desert. Over the course of time and perhaps cataclysmic upheavals, these capabilities were lost and the shaman oligarchs dwindled and became extinct. Yet the memories of their mysterious capabilities and societal power lingered within the collective psyches of the people who succeeded them, thus resulting in the practices of artificial cranial deformation, which we find to have persisted throughout many cultures of the world. Those successor peoples maintain the association between cranial deformation, shamanic magic, and nobility, and thus created traditions in which they attempted to recreate such mystical power through artificial means. A misunderstood association along the lines of the airplane-shaped effigies of Pacific cargo cults, and one which bears the central essence of magical consciousness. A similarity of appearance is seen to imply a unity of spiritual power. Now, this is a kind of just-so story, at least as it stands. And in formulating this narrative, I'm certainly drawing upon the speculations of other theorists who have suggested that archaeological evidence might point to some sort of antediluvian civilization which foreshadowed those such as Mesopotamia, Egypt, or the Americas. As such, whether you find my speculations convincing or not is going to be very much dependent upon whether or not you agree that the accepted academic narratives of human history cannot hold water. I don't have the time in this video to examine the academic narrative or look at its contenders in detail, but I do at least hope to have illustrated the possibility that our understanding of our own past might be profoundly incomplete, and moreover, that developing a more complete understanding may depend primarily upon our capacity to see existing evidence in a new light, rather than the possibility of merely garnering further evidence. The way that we look upon the world very much conditions what we are able to see, and I believe that our accepted ways of viewing things have deeply injured our capacity to actually make sense of where we are in time and space. But I suspect that those who will truly come to cultivate the emerging world will be those who are able to turn their gaze inward, towards the depths within ourselves which we share with the cosmos itself. Our consciousness in the modern world is in many ways radically different than that of people who lived only a few thousand years ago, and still more radically different than that of those who lived tens or even hundreds of thousands of years ago. As such, we cannot simply rewind the clock of human history, but it may nevertheless be possible for us to reclaim the forms of awareness which we have sacrificed on our path through the cultivation of individuality, civilization, and technological science. In doing so, in finding ways to reconnect ourselves with our past, our own consciousness, our sense of collective interconnectedness, and the earth beneath us, we may be able to realize possibilities which even now might seem unimaginable. As always, thanks for watching.